Welcome to your personal deep dive. Today
Deep dive. I like that.
we're diving
It
into,
seems refreshing.
it really does, we're diving into a question that's really fascinated philosophers and economists,
Hmm.
right? Like what truly makes for a good life?
Right.
And you've given us such an interesting mix of notes and articles all about quality of life or QOL,
Right.
um, from like global indexes
Hmm.
to the impact of inventions
Yeah.
throughout history. So I'm
Yeah.
excited to dig in.
Yeah, me too. And you're right. It is such a fascinating question because we immediately go to like money when we think about quality of life.
Totally.
But these sources you've provided, they kind of paint a much more
Oh, yeah.
nuanced and honestly more interesting picture, I
Well,
think.
right. Like on the one hand, we see Canada ranked #1 for quality of life back in 2020.
Right.
But then we see your notes about Zambia, where people are struggling to even have access to like clean water.
Right.
Those realities feel worlds apart.
Yeah, they do. And that's exactly it. So how do we even begin to reconcile those differences? What are the actual factors that allow someone to experience a good life?
Yeah.
And how do you even measure something that feels so
Yeah.
subjective and personal?
Totally. Okay. So let's unpack this.
Okay.
Your notes point to four key dimensions that influence quality of life:
Okay.
economic, social, political, and environmental.
Right.
It's like less about being rich and more about just having a solid foundation on which to like
Yeah.
build a good life.
Yeah. And I think your notes on Zambia really highlight that.
But then how much can we rely on these broad categories of like economic, social, political, and environmental to
Right.
actually tell us something?
Right. Well, that's where those quality of life indicators come in, which
Yeah.
try to take these really complex factors and make them, measurable.
Okay.
You highlighted two key models in your notes, the Human Development Index, or HDI,
Okay.
and the Level of Economic Development Model.
Okay.
Both take different approaches to understanding kind of global quality of life.
Okay, let's start with HDI. That sounds very official.
It is. Think of it as the UN's attempt to capture well-being in like a single number.
Wow.
I know, a single number. They use this basket of factors, life expectancy,
Okay.
education, and GDP per capita to rank countries
Okay.
and kind of get a snapshot of how different nations are doing.
So if a country has a higher HDI score, the better they're doing overall.
Exactly. For example, Canada has a really impressive HDI of
Okay.
0.950.
Wow.
Zambia, which as we've been discussing faces significant challenges, has an HDI of 0.407. Oh, wow.
So that gap in scores really reflects those realities playing out on the ground.
Yeah, that difference is stark. And your notes mention that 64% of Zambia's population lives on less than $3.20 a day.
Yeah.
And 35% lack access to clean drinking water,
Yeah.
which are difficult numbers to even hear.
Yeah.
But they do such a good job of illustrating like why that HDI score is so much lower.
Absolutely. And it goes to show that while economic growth is really important, simply measuring a country's wealth doesn't give us the whole picture of quality of life.
Right.
It's really about how that wealth is distributed
Right.
and whether it actually translates to improvements in people's daily lives.
Yeah, for sure.
You know.
Okay, so that's the HDI. What about this level of economic development model? How does that fit into the picture?
So this model takes a much broader view. Instead of ranking countries on a scale, it categorizes them as either more economically developed countries, or MEDCs,
Okay.
or less economically developed countries, or LEDCs.
So think of it as a way to get a general sense of a country's economic standing, globally.
Ah, so it's kind of like the haves and the have-nots of the world, at least in economic terms.
Yes. In a nutshell, yeah.
Okay.
And you'll often see this linked with this idea of like a north-south divide, with MEDCs primarily located in the northern hemisphere.
Okay.
And LEDCs in the southern hemisphere, however, there's a lot of nuance that this model misses.
Okay, your notes mention that there are some limitations to this model. What are some shortcomings of thinking about countries this way?
Well, for one thing, it's just overly simplistic.
Right.
The world is incredibly complex, and attempting to categorize entire nations as simply developed or developing
Yeah.
can perpetuate these harmful stereotypes and actually mask the inequalities that exist within countries.
Right.
And it also doesn't do a good job of actually capturing quality of life.
Right, because a country might have a really high GDP,
Right.
which would classify it as an MEDC, but still struggle with significant social issues, like inequality or environmental degradation.
Exactly, you hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
You mentioned that Canada was ranked #1 for quality of life in 2020.
Right.
But even Canada grapples with issues like income inequality
Of course.
and struggles to provide adequate support for its indigenous populations.
Yeah.
These are nuances that get lost when we just rely on these overly simplistic models.
Right. So if these models can't really tell the whole story, how do we better understand the impact that advancements and innovations have on our lives?
That's where looking at the impact of inventions and innovations throughout history can be really
Oh, yeah.
illuminating.
Okay.
When we look at how these new ideas and technologies have shaped the way we live, we start to see how quality of life is affected by these changes,
Right.
both for better
Yeah.
and unfortunately for worse.
It's interesting to think about how necessity drives so much innovation.
Right.
Like there's that old saying,
Yeah.
necessity is the mother of invention.
Exactly.
It's true.
Think about even the most basic inventions that we completely take for granted today. Things that you highlighted in your notes, like the wheel or agriculture.
Right.
Those innovations weren't about luxury or convenience, right?
Right.
They were about solving these really fundamental challenges,
Yeah.
like transportation and securing a food supply.
Totally.
And by meeting those basic needs, they completely transformed how humans lived and interacted with the world around them.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine a world without those things now.
Right.
They weren't just innovations, they were revolutions in how people live their daily lives.
Exactly.
But as we've been discussing, progress isn't always linear.
Right.
Your notes pointed out that advancements don't automatically result in a better quality of life for everyone, and the cotton gin is
Yeah.
the perfect example of that.
Yeah, the cotton gin is like the classic case of
Sure.
unintended consequences.
Okay.
On the surface, incredible leap forward, right?
Okay.
Revolutionized cotton production.
Right.
Made it significantly faster and
Yeah.
cheaper to produce.
Okay.
However, this positive innovation also led to a surge in the demand for slave labor,
Right.
which had brutal and devastating consequences for countless individuals.
Yeah, it's a chilling reminder that progress can be a double-edged sword.
Right.
And that even inventions created with good intentions can have these really dark consequences.
Yeah.
Which kind of brings us to what's maybe the most potent example of this in your notes, the Manhattan Project.
Ah, yes, the development of the atomic bomb.
Yeah.
Talk about an innovation with far-reaching repercussions. It's a
Yeah.
really complex issue fraught with ethical dilemmas,
Yeah.
and its legacy continues to be debated to this day.
It's hard to reconcile the fact that this one innovation led to both the end of World War II and then also the start of the nuclear arms race.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, it potentially saved countless lives by bringing a swift end to the war. But on the other hand, it unleashed this unimaginable destructive power and created this new form of fear and tension across the globe.
Right.
So how do you even begin to measure the impact of something like that on quality of life?
It's a question without an easy answer.
Like-
The development of nuclear weapons forced the world to confront this really harsh truth
Okay.
that scientific progress doesn't automatically equal moral progress.
Right.
And in fact, sometimes the two are in direct conflict with each other.
Totally. Which makes me think that any conversation about quality of life can't just focus on what we invent and innovate,
Right.
but we also need to think really critically about how those innovations are used
Yes.
and who benefits from them.
Exactly. We can't just get swept up in the excitement of these new technologies and advancements without considering the potential downsides.
Totally.
When we talk about innovations impacting quality of life,
Yeah.
we need to think beyond just the intended outcome. We also need to grapple with those unforeseen consequences that can ripple throughout history and continue to impact us today.
It strikes me that we often celebrate these innovations as these unqualified advancements for humanity.
Right.
But as we've been discussing, it's so much more complicated than that.
Yeah.
It's not always about better or worse, but rather just understanding this whole complex web of consequences that each invention, each new discovery kind of sets in motion.
Right. And that's why I think examining those innovations critically is so crucial.
Yeah.
It's not about condemning progress, but it's about approaching it with open eyes and being willing to ask these really tough questions.
What are we even striving for when we talk about a good life? Is it about having the latest gadgets and the highest GDP, or is it something way deeper than that?
Well, it seems like your research has uncovered a really crucial insight there. When we move beyond these kind of simplistic notions of wealth and economic growth, we start to see that a truly good life really hinges on this delicate balance of factors.
Yeah, it's like you said earlier, It's not just about how much money a country has, but how that wealth is distributed
Right.
and whether it actually translates into better living conditions,
Hmm.
improved health, greater opportunities for everyone.
And I think perhaps most importantly, it's about fostering that sense of community
Totally.
and connection.
It makes you wonder, though, if these global indexes and economic models, if they can't fully capture the essence of what a good life is,
Yeah,
then what can?
right.
What are we missing in all this data?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right,
Maybe a truly good life can't be quantified or measured at all.
right.
Maybe it's more about fostering those intangible qualities, right?
Hmm.
Happiness, purpose, a sense of belonging.
Yeah, those are definitely harder to put on a spreadsheet.
They are indeed, but that doesn't make them any less important.
Totally.
Perhaps it's in those moments of human connection, in those shared experiences, and that pursuit of something larger than ourselves that we truly discover what it means to live a good life.
That's such a powerful thought. So, as we kind of wrap up this deep dive into quality of life,
Yeah.
it seems like we're left with more questions than answers, but I feel like we've also gained some really valuable insights along the way.
Absolutely. We've unpacked the complexities of trying to define and measure a good life.
Right.
And we've explored how these innovations, while they're capable of this incredible good,
Totally.
they can also have these really significant unintended consequences.
For sure.
But I think most importantly, we've been reminded that a good life is about so much more than just those material possessions
Yeah.
or economic indicators.
It's about so much more than that. And on that note, what will you be pondering long after this deep dive is over? We'd love to hear your thoughts because ultimately, the quest for a good life is a journey we're all on together.